Speaking as someone who suffers from depression, I have found that the occasional use of psychedelic substances has been incredibly useful, not only for gaining insight into my issues, but also as a tool for gaining clarity of thought for several months after each experience. I have used LSD and mushrooms several times over the last few years, and I will continue to do so for as long as I need them. I do not use psychedelic substances purely for recreation. Although the experience is enjoyable, the primary purpose for me is that of a self-medicating nature. With this in mind, I hereby submit my report in the hope that others in a similar situation may find it useful. I have never used truffles before. I have always stuck to LSD obtained from a reliable source and mushrooms, which I grow myself. I decided to try truffles on the recommendation of a friend who swore blind that they were superior to mushrooms. I found it hard to agree with this, as the active ingredients are essentially the same. However, the opportunity to acquire some truffles recently presented itself, so I decided to give them a try. I never use psychedelic substances to simply get high. To me, this is a waste. My depression is such that every so often my mood reaches a point where the usual coping techniques simply do not work. Things such as active distraction, antidepressants, exercise, change in diet, cultivating a new hobby, and so on. I have learned over the years that LSD and mushrooms have an uncanny ability to reset one's mindset. I like to think of it as the etch-a-sketch solution. The mind becomes jumbled and confused, and LSD or psilocybin seem to shake it all away. My mindset upon beginning the truffle experience was, to put it bluntly, dire. I felt lethargic, irritable, unmotivated, and thoroughly unhappy. I wasn't sleeping well, and I had put on a little weight due to comfort eating. It was time to begin the cleansing process. I finished work on Friday afternoon at around 5 p.m. I drove home and immediately began to tidy my living room. Previous experience has taught me that having a psychedelic experience when all around me is untidy does not make for a good time. I dusted, put away all loose clothes, and took out my lava lamp. I draped patterned throws over my sofa and table and proceeded to put on some music. In short, I did everything possible to make my environment as comfortable as possible. I turned off my phone and locked my front door. I was now inside my cocoon and felt safe. The truffles had arrived a few days earlier, and I had been keeping them in my fridge. They were vacuum sealed in small bags. I decided to make tea with them. I boiled the kettle and filled a normal-sized coffee cup with water. I then emptied the contents of one of the truffle bags onto a plate. I used a knife to carefully cut the truffles into very small pieces, approximately the same size as instant coffee granules. By the time I'd done this, the water was no longer at boiling temperature, so I put the truffles into the mug. I took the mug into the living room and listened to some music for about 30 minutes. At 7:15 p.m, the water was still warm, but cool enough to drink. I gave the contents a little stir, then drank it all, including the bits of mushrooms. A little swirling was needed towards the end to get all the bits from the side of the mug. The taste was fairly unremarkable, ever so slightly nutty, not at all unpleasant. I then laid back and decided to play some Tetris on my Game Boy to try and forget that I had just taken the truffles. I find that waiting for something to happen can be a real source of anxiety. It was around 8 p.m. now, and for about 3/4 of an hour, nothing seemed to happen. I began to question whether I'd made the drink correctly. I assumed that preparing truffles the same way I would prepare mushrooms would be sufficient. I began to get annoyed at myself for not researching truffle prep methods. At this point, I felt the first effects. I stood up and was immediately aware of the weight of my body. It felt very heavy. My legs were a little wobbly and the carpet felt very spongy. These sensations were not a surprise at all. It felt almost exactly like a mushroom high. The next emotion I experienced was relief. Relief at the thought that I had in fact prepared the truffles correctly. I decided to take this opportunity to have a last cigarette. I had no idea how strong the effect would be, or how much of my bodily functions I would retain, so instead of running the risk of dropping a cigarette, I thought it'd be wise to have one now. I did not get that far, however. I held a cigarette to my lips and struck my lighter. The flame began to flicker as though it was in a breeze, and it had a sort of halo aura around it. I looked up and saw that my lamps also had similar effects around them. I found this most interesting and completely forgot about having a cigarette. Indeed, I remember putting down my lighter but kept holding the unlit cigarette. I noticed the time. It was 20 past 8. The light effects were still present, but now I could also see that the walls were expanding and contracting slightly. This did not interest me at all. I had seen this effect many times before while under the influence of LSD, and I paid no attention to it. What I did pay a lot of attention to, however, was the spectrum light effect that seemed to emanate from the corner of my peripheral vision. I found this to be most entertaining, and it was not something that I had previously experienced with mushrooms or LSD. It was as though there was a rainbow in each corner of the room, but when I turned to look at them, they disappeared. I tried to look as far to my left as I could without turning my head. This conjured up in my mind the image of an owl turning his head around. For some reason, this was instantly hysterical to me, and I succumbed to a raging fit of the giggles. I'm not sure how long this went on, but when I stopped laughing, my throat was sore and I had tears down my face. I would describe this part of the experience as having a distinctly disassociating quality. It was not unpleasant, but I did feel a little annoyed afterwards because I felt as though I had spent too long a period laughing at what I thought was a beginner hallucination. From this point on, I do not recall what time the events took place. I only remember the order in which they happened. My throat felt very sore and dry. I can only assume this was from all the laughing, so I decided to get up and find something to drink. Up until this point, I had remained on my sofa. As I stood up, I noticed that my body felt very heavy. My legs were like jelly, and the floor felt very soft and squishy. If anyone were to have seen me at this point, I highly doubt that I would have been able to hide the fact that I was under the influence of something. I stumbled to the kitchen and took a bottle of Coke from the fridge. The light inside the fridge was blinding. Spectacular rainbow effects radiated from the bulb in a sort of spherical gradient effect. Upon opening the bottle, the normal fizzing sound was magnified tenfold. It was like no other sound I had ever heard. A metallic sound whooshing, almost like a dog bark, but played backwards through some kind of effects filter. I enjoyed this sound very much. So much so that I stood by the open fridge for a while, closing and reopening the bottle over and over. In fact, I do not remember even having anything to drink. The next thing I remember is being back on the sofa. I do not remember walking back to it. I mentioned this earlier, but the truffles had a very definite dissociative effect. By this point, I was feeling very tired, and I decided that it was probably time for bed. I always have a cigarette before bed, and even though I was very much intoxicated, I made a conscious decision to have one. I sat on the floor in front of my coffee table. I rested my chin on the table and placed an ashtray near my face. I had a very definite concern in my mind of possibly accidentally burning myself, or worse yet, burning my living room down to the ground. I put the cigarette to what I presumed were my lips and reached for my lighter. Again, the rainbow effect was present around the bright light that the flame created. I successfully lit the cigarette and managed to smoke the whole thing. The sounds that the burning tobacco made were exquisite. A very loud, crackling sound. It sounded exactly like leaves and sticks being broken underfoot. I had a very vivid image of someone walking through the woods. I closed my eyes to try and enjoy it more. At this point, I realized that I had thus far neglected to pay any attention to any closed-eye visuals that may be occurring. Excited at this prospect, I made a beeline for my bed. The clock in my bedroom said 20 past midnight. Time had apparently gotten away from me, although it felt as though I had really not done much at all. I put my headphones on and listened to some music, specifically a group called Tangerine Dream. As I closed my eyes, I began to see the familiar grayscale swirling patterns. This was not new to me and I found it rather boring. Although something I did enjoy was the way my body felt. I did not feel paralyzed, but rather I had absolutely no motivation to move whatsoever. I felt trapped, but not in a frightening way. I was lying on my side, but I felt as though I was completely flat. Soon after this, I realized that I had been slowly and quietly muttering to myself. This came as a shock and was a little unsettling. I could not work out if I was either hearing voices or talking to myself. I could not make out what was being said. I put my hands to my lips to feel if my lips were moving. They were. This was by far the most rewarding part of the whole experience. I felt as though I had crossed over into some sort of alternative way of thinking, allowing my subconscious self to think freely without the handicap of my inner monologue. I felt utterly divided. I felt like two different people in one body. I had removed my headphones, but I do not remember doing this. Sadly, the next memory I have is that of waking up. My alarm was set for 10 in the morning, and it woke me like it always does. I had an incredibly dry mouth, and the first thing I did was have an enormous glass of water. My body worked normally again, and the only after effect I had was a sore neck. I have no idea how this occurred. The first thing I will say is that the truffle experience helped me achieve that which I have achieved from LSD and mushrooms, and my depressive symptoms had gone. No more confusion, irritability, anxiety, or feelings of sadness. I felt refreshed and alert. I still do today. I took truffles approximately 5 weeks ago. For me, psychedelic experiences are an essential and invaluable tool for maintaining a clear mindset. The difference between mushrooms and truffles, in my opinion, was minimal. Some differences occurred as outlined previously, but I can only put this down to differences in strength and strain. The mushrooms I grow are Psilocybe mexicana, and the truffles were the Atlantis strain. I'm no expert on strains, however, so I have no real input on this. I will most definitely be using truffles again. The experience was very similar to mushrooms, but had some extra qualities that I would very much like to experience again. I have a diagnosis of clinical depression, and this has been the case for well over 10 years. I have attended psychotherapy and taken various SSRI medications over the years. I have not had any prescribed medication for the last 2 years or so. Medication for me, at best, was a way of treating my symptoms and not the condition. I have reached a point in my life now where I can say with sincerity that I have a handle on my condition and have no further need for medication. I find psychedelic substances to be extremely useful in resetting my mind when my mood reaches a point of no return on the depressive scale, as it were. However, I do not for one moment encourage anyone listening to this to self-medicate with psychedelics, instead of taking antidepressants prescribed by a doctor. I mention it in my report only for the sake of accuracy and authenticity. Thanks for listening.